Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into a topic today that might surprise you: landslides.
Surprising.
Well, yeah, we usually cover super high-tech stuff, but this is kind of back to nature, right?
True. But super important. Landslides can be devastating, especially in urban areas.
Right. And that's why we're looking at Busan, South Korea.
The coastal city with mountains, a recipe for potential landslide problems, especially with typhoons.
Oh, for sure. And that's where this research paper comes in. A shallow slide prediction model combining rainfall threshold warnings and shallow slide susceptibility in Busan, Korea. Long title.
Quite a mouthful, but it breaks down this really cool approach to predicting landslides. They're combining rainfall data with, like, the geography of Busan.
So they're looking at where landslides are most likely to happen, right? And how to maybe predict them better.
Exactly. And the numbers are pretty startling. Between 1999 and 2014, there were over 200 landslides in Busan, caused over $1 billion in damage.
Whoa. $1 billion. That's a lot of damage. So how are they trying to predict these landslides?
Well, they're using a two-pronged approach. First, they're looking at something called rainfall thresholds.
Okay, rainfall thresholds. What's that all about?
Basically, they looked at historical rainfall data for 35 landslide events. They found that both the intensity of the rain and how long it rained played a huge role in triggering landslides.
So like a short, super heavy downpour could be just as bad as days of light rain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they actually came up with an equation to show this relationship,
An equation, huh? And what does that tell us?
that both the intensity and duration are important for landslide prediction.
Makes sense. So they look at how much it rains and for how long. What then?
Well, based on that equation and the rainfall patterns they studied, they actually came up with 4 different warning levels. You have null, watch, attention, and get this, alarm.
Alarm. I bet that gets people's attention. Even a small chance of a landslide has got to be pretty scary.
Yeah, for sure. But predicting landslides based on rain is only part of the story, right?
Right. What else do they look at?
They look at the land itself. They analyze the landscape, things like the steepness of slopes, the types of soil, even what kinds of trees are growing in an area.
Wow, so it's not just how much rain falls, but also what that rain encounters once it hits the ground.
You got it. It's like, does the water soak in, run off? Where does it go?
Yeah.
And they don't just look at 1 or 2 factors. They actually analyze 14 different geographic factors.
14. Wow, that's a lot. What are some examples?
Well, like I said, topography is a big one, like steep slopes. Then there's hydrology, how water interacts with the land, like is the area near a river. And then soil types.
Oh, yeah. I remember from like basic science, different soils hold water differently, right?
Totally. Some are porous, some are denser. And they even looked at the types of trees and the underlying geology. Certain rock types are weaker, more prone to erosion, which can destabilize the ground.
That's amazing. They really considered everything. So they have all this data about rainfall in the land, but how do they bring it all together to predict where a landslide might happen?
That's where things get really cool. They created a matrix. Basically, it's a grid where one side represents the different rainfall warning levels, and the other side represents the different levels of landslide susceptibility.
So they combine those two things. That's pretty clever.
Right, so you can see how the risk changes with different rainfall levels. For example, let's say an area has a high susceptibility to landslides because of the geography. Then you get heavy rain.
The risk level on that matrix shoots up.
Exactly. And to illustrate this, they used a real-world example, the Gijang area landslide back in 2009.
What happened there?
Well, that area already had a high susceptibility to landslides. And then as the rain intensified, they could see the risk level on their matrix just go way up.
So their model worked. It sounds like this two-pronged approach using rainfall and the landscape analysis could be a game changer for landslide prediction.
Definitely has a lot of potential. But, no model is perfect. There's still some limitations to what they've done.
Right, of course. But, is this research ready to be used in a real-world warning system right now?
It's a good first step, but it needs more work, more data, especially on the consequences of past landslides. And they need to see how the model performs with more rainfall events over time. Really put it through its paces.
Yeah, validate it. So it's a work in progress, but a very promising one. But, okay, let's say they perfect this model. What can a city like Busan actually do with this knowledge? Knowing a landslide might happen is one thing, but what actions can they take to, prevent or mitigate the damage?
That is the million-dollar question, and that's exactly what we'll explore in part 2 of this deep dive.
All right, so we've got this model that can predict landslides in Busan. Pretty amazing. But, knowing is only half the battle. What can they actually do with this information? What concrete steps can they take, to protect people and property?
Well, I think the most obvious is creating a much more effective early warning system. Like, imagine integrating this model with their current weather monitoring.
So as the rainfall starts to hit those critical thresholds, like we were talking about, they could issue like very specific alerts, right, to the people living in those highest risk areas.
Exactly. Instead of this blanket warning for the whole city, which, let's face it, people probably ignore, they could focus on specific neighborhoods.
Yeah, that makes sense. Target the warnings to where they're really needed. So what? They send out a text or something. What happens then?
Those warnings could trigger all sorts of preventative actions. Think about it. Evacuating people from high-risk areas, closing roads that are known to be dangerous, even positioning those first responders.
So you're talking about shifting from like a reactive approach to a proactive one, right? Getting ahead of the problem. I like it. But early warnings are just the start, right? What about making Busan, more resilient to landslides in the long run?
Absolutely. This research could be a game changer for urban planning, how they approach new development. I mean, by understanding those geographic factors, the susceptibility, city planners could make smarter choices about where to build in the first place.
So no more building on like steep slopes with unstable soil. Seems obvious, but
Yeah, ideally, make that kind of information, like the foundation of their zoning regulations, their infrastructure, even the design of buildings, make them more resistant to landslides.
like using this research to create, I don't know, a blueprint for a safer Busan. But let's be real, there's already a ton of homes and buildings in those high-risk zones. What about them?
Right, yeah, good point. But it's not a lost cause. They can do targeted mitigation, lots of engineering solutions to help stabilize slopes, reduce risk, even in areas that are already developed.
So even in places where development's already happened, they can still make things safer.
Exactly. Think about things like retaining walls to hold back soil, better drainage systems to redirect the water, and even reforestation programs to make that soil more stable. And this model can help them prioritize those efforts, focus resources where they matter most.
It's all about working smarter, not harder. But, I mean, it's one thing to have the technology and the research, right? It's another to actually put it into practice. There's got to be some challenges there, especially in a big city like Busan.
Oh, there are tons of challenges. Cost,
Right.
infrastructure improvements aren't cheap. And then there's disruption to those existing communities while they're making those improvements. And honestly, maybe the biggest hurdle is just the political will.
Yeah, to actually prioritize like long-term resilience over, short-term gains. Right. Always easier said than done.
Exactly. That's what
Hmm.
makes this research so important. It's not just about predicting landslides. It's about getting everyone on the same page.
Mm.
City planners, government, residents, everyone. So they can make these informed decisions about how to live safely in an environment that, has these inherent risks.
So it's a social and political challenge as much as a scientific one.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But that's what makes it so interesting. It's not just the technical stuff. It's about using that knowledge to actually create a safer, more resilient future for everyone.
Mm.
But of course, Busan's just one city.
Right. What about, other parts of the world facing similar challenges with landslides? Can they learn something from this?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the specifics might vary, obviously, but the core principles here, using rainfall data and looking at the landscape, that's applicable anywhere.
So it's like a template almost.
Exactly. They can adapt it, customize it for their region. But also, I think just the idea of sharing knowledge and collaborating, that's huge.
Yeah.
Researchers around the world working together, learning from Busan, developing even more sophisticated tools.
It's like a global community all focused on tackling this, increasingly urgent problem, especially with climate change, right? Making those extreme weather events like those heavy downpours more frequent. This kind of research is just going to become more and more crucial. We've covered a lot, but I still have this one nagging question.
Another so what moment.
Always. So we talked about what cities can do, researchers, but what about our listeners? What can they do with this information? They're not all city planners or scientists.
That is a great question and a surprisingly important one. That's actually where we're going to pick things up in part 3.
Okay, so we've covered what cities can do, researchers can do, but yeah, what about the rest of us? We're not all, engineers and policymakers. What can we actually do with this information about landslides?
It's easy to feel kind of helpless when we talk about natural disasters, but I think understanding the risks is actually really empowering.
Knowledge is power, right? But how do we translate that into action? Like, give us some concrete steps. What can our listeners do?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's awareness. If you live in an area that could be prone to landslides like hilly regions, mountainous areas, you got to pay attention, especially during heavy rainfall. Keep an eye on those weather forecasts and know your local warning systems, evacuation routes, all that stuff.
So be prepared. Know what to do if, things start to get dicey.
Exactly. But it goes beyond just personal preparedness. You can use this knowledge to actually become an advocate for change in your community.
Okay, how do we do that? How do we become like landslide activists?
Start asking questions. Reach out to your local government. Find out what they're doing, what measures they have in place. Are they using the latest prediction models? Do they have good early warning systems? What about building codes in high-risk areas? Are they enforcing those?
Holding our leaders accountable, making sure they're, doing everything they can to keep people safe.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of getting involved in your community. Talk to your neighbors. Support organizations that are working on, disaster preparedness, or volunteer your time to help with some of these risk reduction efforts.
Like that old saying, right? There's strength in numbers.
For sure. Working together, we can really push for change, make a difference. And remember, even small actions can add up.
Huh.
Something as simple as planting trees on a slope that can help stabilize the soil.
Hmm.
Or if you see signs of erosion, report it. It all contributes to, a safer environment for everyone.
I love that. It's about taking ownership, being proactive, not just waiting for someone else to fix things. But I gotta say, sometimes these problems feel so big, it's easy to get discouraged. What do you say to people who feel that way?
It's true. These are
Well,
big
yeah.
challenges. But every action, no matter how small, makes a difference. It chips away at the problem. Think of it like this. Even a tiny pebble can start an avalanche.
Wow, I like that. That's a really powerful image. So, to wrap things up for our listeners, it's about awareness, preparedness, advocating for change, and taking action in our communities, right?
Yeah.
However we can.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in creating a safer world for ourselves and for future generations. It's about taking action.
Well, this has been, I gotta say, not just informative, but inspiring. I feel like I'm walking away with a to-do list.
That's great to hear. Remember, knowledge is power, but only if we use it.
Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your expertise.
My pleasure. It was a great conversation.
And to all our listeners, thanks for tuning in. We hope you learned something new and, more importantly, that you're inspired to take action. Stay curious, stay engaged, and stay safe out there.